The great thing about private land is you can actually shrink a buck's home range. And what I mean by that is you can shrink it during the daylight. Now, if you're out on remote public land, big wilderness areas, then bucks will fully express their long and large home range. In fact, some private land settings, you'll even see the bucks, like during the rut, will move from doe hangout to doe hangout. We might be talking just a handful of does, just small doe family groups that are scattered a mile apart. And so that buck will really range out over a week period. He might be in 3 miles this way, 2 miles this way. That is not the case when it comes to private land. And so number one, when you want to shrink a buck's home range and you want to be able to get a look at them most days of the week or quite often during the season, you have to ignore the 3 mile home range that scientists talk about a buck's home range naturally is. And you really need to ignore that. You got to remember that most scientists I'm not saying they're not deer hunters, but they're not out there actively going after a target buck on a weekly basis that lives in and around their land or the land that they hunt and shooting that buck. It's more, they have 1,200 acres here. They have this lease at several thousand acres here. They're working on long, large private land or public land tract, government land, or even commercial forestry property. So the bucks with these big collared ranges. I talked to John Azoga long ago. We talked about the lack of information for small landowners when it comes to whitetails, because a lot of these big scientific studies don't apply, even though they're taught that way. And he just said that it would take too much money and too much time to really follow bucks on small private land parcels and core ranges to really see how far they travel and to really figure in all the complexities to actually pass peer review, the scrutiny of peer review, where you're looking at 40 acre parcels, 80 acres, 200, 500, even 800 acre parcels. And you're looking at these size of parcels and trying to really fully understand how far a buck's going to move. So first thing you do is get rid of that 3 mile home range, because we're only looking at during the daylight. A buck's range will be just a small portion of during the daylight as opposed to during the dark and after dark. And looking at a buck's home range, if it is 3 square miles, 95% of that will be during the nighttime. We don't care where he's at during the nighttime. We only care about where he's during the day, and that's where the opportunity comes in for you. Because a buck will typically only move 200 to 400 yards during the daylight if you give him those conditions and you match the concepts to where you can look at him during the daylight often, and you can expect a reasonable amount of success consistently on those target bucks. I find 80% of the time over a 10-year period, you can find those mature bucks you're after if you match the conditions that he needs. First off, he's got to have constant food and cover. What I mean by that is, what's different on public land is even if you get a buck figured out, he might move, because if his daylight food source, meaning just that third feeding of the day, changes, then he'll leave. If he can find a great food source somewhere else, and your food source is white oak acorns in September, early October, and then that food source dries up, he's obviously going to move. He's going to move a long ways. Where those does and fawns are homebodies. They'll stick around a little bit more. Mature buck's willing to travel for 1.5 miles, 2 miles to find another food source, that food source of the moment. On public land, he'll be gone. And that's natural for him to do so, where those does have just a fraction of the home range, 20%, 15%, 25% of what a buck's home range is. And so even if they move, they don't move that far. They're more homebodies. Again, that buck will travel a long ways. But on private land, what's different is you can give him the same food source and the same cover all year long. Now, that same food source, meaning he goes to this food source every afternoon. If you give him the diversity that stands the test of time all season long, then he'll be there and relate to your property all season long. Unlike if you just plant one food source in there, each food source might be good for 6-7 weeks. Your season is 3 to 4 months long. If you have great beans and it's good in through September, well, what about middle of October, November, December? What if you have lots of food sources in the area and he can go here, he can go over there? What if he likes corn in November? And so you have corn. That's all you have. Well, what about October, September? He doesn't establish a pattern of use on your land. Therefore, you don't get to see him. Therefore, he has a large home range. Therefore, he dies at a younger age. You think about all of this. The larger his core range is, especially on private land where you're crossing multiple fences, you're exposing yourself to multiple hunters, then his life expectancy decreases the larger his home range is within private land. Think about that. Public land's a little bit different, because lots of the areas of public land I go, whether it's Pennsylvania or Michigan, and I know of lots of client properties that butt up to public land, not a lot of people hunting out far into public land. So there can be huge areas where a buck can roam and never see a hunter during the day, believe it or not, on public land. And that's pretty normal on public land. So he can express his age and maturity sometimes better on public land than private, simply because there's a lot more borders that he's crossing. But again, you can go back to a small parcel and you can shrink his home range by the conditions you offer, and you have to have consistent food and cover. That doesn't mean the same food for the entire season. It means the same location, and it means you have to offer enough diversity and variety so he focuses on that food on a daily basis or weekly basis. And even if he leaves for a week or two at a time, he actually comes back and focuses on your land, because you're one of those 5% club herd influencer type properties as opposed to everyone else out there. You do that by establishing lines of movement. What I find is mature bucks will stay in the proximity of each other if they can't see each other, and if they have different ways that they can go. And I'll give you an example of this. You have a ridge right here. This is a property we're talking about. We were just filming, Gunner and I were filming out in an area where we have a larger holding plot. That's a plot that I expect deer to go to, hold till dark, and then leave and go out to the ag field around us. Maybe they're going out into open hardwoods around you to feed all night. Maybe they're going into bait piles on neighboring properties. But bottom line is they're focusing on your food source right before dark, has, you know, some type of food plot. That's all that's going to be able to last for the entire season. Chestnuts that are gone in the early season sometimes. White oaks are gone in the early season. Red oaks are more mid-season acorn mass crop. Apple trees are very specific to a certain time of the year. Once they drop, they're gone. So you can't build a herd on any of those food sources. It has to be a food plot on public or on private land. So when you do that, you have that variety, and you start to spread these out. I'm talking about a food plot we were standing by, supported a bedding area. We have a small hunting plot nearby, and I kind of drew it out because it's easier than pointing when we're out in the woods. But we have these various food plots. We were right here, and then we went out on a ridge top bedding right in this location. So this entire area, green food plot over here on another portion of the property. But this is all bedding in this location, just like this, all around here. So although bucks might share a common bedding area with ridges and valleys and water down the valley, they don't see each other, and they have different lines that they can move when they exit their bedding area. And what I mean by that is you have a buck that's bedded right here on this side of the ridge during the daylight. Of course, he has to have enough browse in his bedding area. That's more important than the actual quality of the bedding area. As long as he has browse, he can get away from other deer. You want does stacked in closer to these food sources. They don't want to travel too far. Again, they're homebodies. So if you have good food and it lasts for the season, you can stack those does against it. But these bucks, you can have a buck that's bedded here. He'll travel out and hit this food source. You can have a buck that's here, travel here. You can have a buck that's inside here in the valley. He travels up here. And don't ever think the bucks bed high, bed low. If the food's high, they bed low. If the food's low, they bed high. That's the way it works. It's as easy as that. You might have a buck that beds here and goes to this one. You have a buck that beds here, goes to this end of the food. Another one that beds over here and goes to this end of the food. So you can have 80 acres, 60 acres, 70 acres, 30, where you have multiple mature bucks, let alone if they're bedding on the outside on someone else's land and coming into these food sources right at dark. What I find is if they're on someone else's land, they get pushed on that land, they'll always cheat to the side that they want to hit for food in the afternoon. So they'll draw closer into your land as pressure heats up around you, even on small parcels. These movement lines, they're not going to be more than 300, 400, 500 yards at the most. And a lot of times they're sandwiched down to 200 yards at most. So that creates a very small window. Again, if those bucks are moving 500, 700 yards, 900 yards during the daylight, they're going to die at a much younger age because they have a large core home range. They're exposing themselves to lots of property boarders and hunters, and they're going to get shot. They're not going to make it, and that obviously is the number one mortality of a buck, is getting shot by hunters. Take the hunters out of the equation. Again, he only wants to focus on 200 to 400 yards during the daylight. So if you set your property up for that and you offer different lines of movement, then you can create the opportunity for multiple mature bucks on your property, because again, they're only expressing a very small, tiny portion of their overall home range during the daylight, and the daylight is all you're concerned about. So if you keep the lines of movement intact, meaning you don't destroy it, those deer will be there. What do I mean by don't destroy it? That means if I'm going, because I think, wow, I'm in the middle of all these bucks during the daylight, I'm going to sit right there. You get in there, you spook them. You get out of there, you spook them. There's something always downwind of you. You're making noise. You have to leave this core area intact. Maybe you have a house right there in the middle. You have a driveway that goes in. Well, then you can go out and hunt this movement that goes around your house. Maybe you can slip out the driveway, go around. There's always a way to do it, but you're protecting as many areas as you can of those lines of movement and not destroying those movements within that line of movement. Very critical. When you have those lines of movement, bucks will slide into that line of movement, and what's interesting, they'll follow typical doe patterns within that movement, meaning those does are bedded closer to the food. They come in from this angle, a buck comes in from that angle. When you have multiple lines of movement, you have multiple doe family group movements, and bucks will relate to that. If you have different food sources peaking at different times, those does and fawns are going back and forth to different food sources. The dominant does kick the smaller does out, the younger does, and then there's no consistency with doe bedding. If you don't have consistent doe bedding, hitting those food plots at a certain time every single afternoon, you're not going to have consistent bucks. So then you take a movement like this where you have multiple lines of potential movements, but because you have differing food sources or bedding areas that are getting spooked out for hunting pressure or plots that are getting spooked out for hunting pressure, you greatly diminish the number of mature bucks that'll focus on your land during the daylight at any given time during the season. It's very critical to understand that. When you have different food sources planted around your property, different food in every plot, that's a really bad thing, very bad, because then you only have one group of does that rules a roost, a few other ones that follow, and you leave room for one mature buck instead of 5 or 6 that'll focus on your land on a daily basis. Now, they're not going to focus on your land every day of the season, but you'll find that they'll focus on it consistently for 2-3 months at a time. Even if it's a week here, 2 weeks there, another week here, they're focusing on your land a much, much larger percentage of time than every other property in the neighborhood combined. And that is something you could do. I've seen that for many years, decades. I've seen it on client properties all the time. And again, you have to go back and ignore this 3-mile home range and the large home range because we don't really care where those bucks are at night. And we don't care about where they're at on public land, big commercial properties where they can wander forever and not find good food or find does or find good cover or changing cover, changing food sources. We only care about what can happen during the hours of hunting on small properties. You can't destroy it. If you do that, you won't have that. The biggest risk is not having this and not setting up these lines of movement on your property so that bucks can actually slide into those lines during the daylight. If you say, well, I can't get in here in the middle of the hunt and that mature buck makes it another year, so what? Now he's a year older. That's pretty cool. Maybe you wanted to shoot him when he was 3 years old or 2. Now he's 3 or 4. So that's a lot of fun. You allow him to grow. The smaller you shrink his home range, the older your average buck in the area becomes, and it only takes one small property to influence that. I've seen it time and time again. Doesn't have to be perfect. Number 5. What do I mean by that? You don't have to have the perfect food plots, the perfect bedding area, the perfect grass, the perfect native grass blend, the perfect hinge cuts, the perfect deer bed. You don't have to have any of that. What you have to have is adequacy. You have to have the foundation to the plan. Just like a house. Lots of people have different paint, different interior walls, different finishings in the bathroom, in the kitchen, different types of furniture, but they have that same basic house structure that's appropriate for people to live in. Once you develop that for them, that's where they stay. Doesn't matter what's on the inside. You have to have that foundation of movement, that foundation of cover, food. That means your food, instead of being a 10 out of 10, who cares if it's a 7? It'll work, unless you're competing against a neighbor where they're drawing everything over because they have something else. Cover just has to be adequate. I find cover's the least important because as long as you have adequate cover, meaning you're not spooking it out, you can get out of the wind, they can get some kind of thermal protection if needed during different times of the hunting season. But if you have consistent food and you have cover that they can call their own, they're going to stay. Where if they don't have the food, they're gone, regardless of the cover. So think about that when the priority of food and cover, which is more important. Food's way more important because without food, then you don't have deer to fill your cover or your bedding areas. If you have the best bedding areas, even if you have good hardwood regeneration for the daytime, unless you're up north where that's the food, hardwood regeneration, because there's no other great food around, there's no ag field, there's no food plots, there's no bait piles, then they might stay on your land when you have a clear cut. That's where people hunt in big wilderness areas. You hunt clear cuts. You hunt fresh clear cuts, ones that are 1 to 3, 4 years old, depending on the region. Even 6 or 7 years old in an up north location where the growth is a lot slower. But on private land, you need food, you need browse, you need adequate food plots, adequate cover, and then you can create, not only shrink that buck's home range, but you'll make them older because of that. And you can actually be that true herd influencer that is, and I talk about less than 5% of all landowners out there are herd influencers because they don't do this right here. Do this, shrink a buck's home range, develop lines of movement, have consistent food and cover, ignore the 3-mile home range, and you'll not only experience a great herd, but a great hunt. You can't have one without the other. You can't have great habitat. It's not great habitat if you don't have a great herd and a great hunt. All of those go together. It makes sense. You can't have one without the other. You have to have a great herd. You have to have a great hunt. You have to have great habitat. Do that. Create these lines of movement. Make the deer feel that they're living in it. They have it themselves. And you'll have a great hunt, not only this season, but for decades to come. Now, I'm excited again this year to host our Camp Kicking Bear charity event. Last year we did it in June, and it was a big success. We were able to raise over $21,000 for Camp Kicking Bear. There's some people that actually made comments that they get sick of hearing about this kind of stuff and whatever else. I think they didn't understand that we're actually raising money. This Camp Kicking Bear is, to me, the #1 children's organization that gets kids in the outdoors, their families, especially a lot of kids that don't have the opportunity to do so otherwise. June 11th, I'll have more details coming out about this, but you can email us for early registration. June 11th, it'd be midday, like 11 to 4 type thing, 10 to 5, 10 to 4. What I do is there's 50 people that register for this. We give that all to Camp Kicking Bear. Well, it's a habitat day. We go out for a couple hours on the property and I show you some strategies that you can take home to your own land. Number 3, we have a hunt raffle for 100 people. The registration for 50 people is $300. That gets you in the door to actually see the property and the land. $100 gets you in a hunt raffle times 100 people. We had Leo from Lower Michigan had a hunt last year, many memories, end of September for a couple days. Number 4, lots of door prizes, Matthews bows, blinds. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that we give away, really good stuff for you too. Kids are free. I think we had about 25, 30 kids last year. All proceeds, again, go to Kicking Bear. Every dollar, every dime we raise goes to Kicking Bear. We'll have some other auction. Last year, Chris B came. We might have Kevin Smith, retired Major League Baseball player. I hear that Gary Suter, he's a NHL Hall of Famer, he might show up too. So there's some chance to meet there. And then, of course, Ray Howell. He was here last year. He delivered his testimony. It was an awesome, inspirational talk that he gave to everyone. Hope to see you there. Look for further details on the site and then the description for the video.